Fire making 101. First thing you got to think about is the location of your fire. And let's talk about the dangers first, okay? You set up a fire and then realize overhead there's a ton of dead branches and it's slightly windy out. Okay, not a good situation. So you want to look up and overhead, see that is safe. You got nothing that's going to come crashing down on you, your camp, your campmates. Second is looking just right on the ground. So are you basically setting up a fire in the middle of a field of dried grass? Probably not your best option. So you want to make sure there's nothing that can catch really quickly. That might mean clearing out some area so that it's safer, but you got dangers overhead, you got dangers on the ground. Third thing to think about is possibly dangers out there. And while this wasn't a danger, it'll give you an example. My first survival outing I ever did by myself, solo in the woods, I think it was like me, a knife, maybe some matches and a wool blanket. And I set up my shelter right on a deer run. So at 2 in the morning, I got these deer that are coming through, trying to figure out what the smell is. I'm in my shelter. I pop my head out. They go darting off into the woods. Deer, probably not a major danger unless you're in the middle of a rut, which that could be, the rutting season, which could be a danger. But if you're out in country that's got moose, bear, mountain lion, are you setting up your fire or your camp even in an area that's prone to have a lot of activity from animals that could be a possible threat to you? So keep that in mind. If you're in areas where there's lots of snakes, poisonous snakes, other things like that, you want to make sure you're not setting up your fire in a place where they're prone to be super active. Now you can't, in a survival situation, maybe you can't keep away from every possible danger, but think about those things first, okay? So fire making 101, first thing, dangers, overhead, on the ground, and just out and about. Next we'll talk about where to actually build your fire. So once you've dealt with the danger question, now you can actually think about where am I going to build my fire. As you can see behind me, I got a big rock. Now this is a great thing to build a fire up against so that it will reflect the heat back toward you. A couple things to think about. Consider the rock, okay? So I've actually tried to cook on slate before, like made a little slate stove out of some rocks, and slate is very porous. You get some water in there, it starts to boil. I literally had my stove explode in camp. I'm like diving into my tent. So make sure you're aware of, this is a huge rock that's probably not gonna crack apart. If you're in like a canyon area and you're making a fire and you have a rock that if it gets heated up quickly especially, it can break and come tumbling down on you. You want to be very careful of that. So basically what I'm talking about is a rock to reflect the heat back to you. So that's one thing. Out of the wind. You don't want to be setting up a fire, think, oh, this is a really pretty location, and then there's wind tearing across the top of your mountain all night long. So find a place that's out of the wind. Finding a place with good resources when it comes to wood, basically, So if you can set it up in such a way that you have your fire in a place where you don't have to wander, a mile away to get wood, obviously that's an ideal situation. The last thing we'll talk about is actually having it near or in your camp. Now, in the vast majority of survival situations, that's probably a good choice because you want to have your fire near where you're going to be sleeping. There's a kind of a protective reality of that, keeping some animals away. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is if you are in a place where you're going to be cooking right there, the smells can attract animals. So if you've ever been in grizzly country, they tell you to do your cooking away from camp, so any smells that are there stay there, and that you're not kind of cooking right in camp. All the smells of what you're cooking is attracting the bears to you. So something to be aware of, something to be thinking about. Right here, you can also see I got some hemlock. This is great for burning, but it's actually right over the top of where I want to make my fire right now. So I need to clear this area out a little bit, and then we'll talk about the process of actually getting the fire going and show you what that looks like. Two other things I want to mention about building your fire. The first thing is you have that rock reflecting or something reflecting the heat towards you. It's great if you can get something behind you so that the heat is coming at you and what's going past you is actually being reflected onto your back. So that's another plus. The other thing to be aware of is sunlight. It's great if you got a fire that can produce heat, but if you can get into the sun, especially if you're in a situation where you got to get heat because you're cold, the sun is a huge, huge help. When I was hiking in here, I was in the shade for a while and I came out to an open area and I could just stand in the sun and all of a sudden you feel better, you're warmer. So keep that in mind when you're building your fire. If you have to do it, in deep cover of the woods just by where your camp is set up, it is what it is. But if you can get into that place where you've got a fire and you also have the sun reflecting on you, and depending on what part of the world you're in, northern exposure, southern exposure, whatever it might be, figure out what your, what north is, and then orient yourself so that you can get the most sun, as much sun as possible. I've collected some wood. I've made a bunch of piles. I'll show you that in a second. Let me just say that I would collect way more wood if this was a overnight or B long-term survival situation. I just want to get the piles big enough to show you the different sizes, and then I would probably literally collect 10 times as much for the larger pile just to make sure it burns through the night. It is a terrible thing in the middle of the night to have to go wandering through the woods, especially if you don't have a headlamp, flashlight, to try and find wood. Pile number 1 you're looking at here is what I would call kindling. And Tinder, generally for me at least, how I think about it is if I'm trying to start a fire with a bow drill or some sort of spark off a ferro rod or something like that, Tinder for me is I'm shooting that spark right into my tinder to get the fire basically started in that tiny little pocket of tinder, and then I would put this stuff you're looking on right now on top of that to get it going more. So this is a pile of just some tiny hemlock branches from all around the area here. So we'll start with that. Then we'll move over to this pile here. And let me just take off my my glove and show you, kind of compared to the size of my hand, compared to the size of my finger. Still quite small, and this is just to feed on top of the flame we get going. Move up to a slightly larger size. We're talking about pencil size, and then up to a larger size. That's about as wide as 2 fingers, and then over to the even larger size. And then from here you're going to just keep getting bigger and bigger. You want to make sure that you have enough wood to burn and that you don't have tons and tons of tiny little piles of small wood. You want to eventually get to larger pieces of wood so that you you don't have to be working constantly to keep the fire going. One thing I do encourage people is to always have wood from this size really down to this smallest size right here around, so that if you have to go away, you come back and your fire's out, you're not spending more time going out to collect a ton of wood. Just have a little pile ready so you can get it going in case it starts to die out. All right, one other thing I'll show you is that you can see there's my reflecting rock, and I put a log there and a log here. And I did that just to kind of demarcate where my fire is going to be, so it's not A, spreading all over the place, and B, it's a little bit contained. I normally would do this with some rocks, but because it is winter, most of the rocks around this, where I'm at, are either frozen into the ground or just too big to move. So I'm using these logs. Eventually, if these guys start to, char a little bit or catch on fire, probably not going to be a huge deal because they are very wet and they're quite large. So this just kind of reminds me, okay, don't let the fire get too huge and out of control. Keep it in this area. And again, if the weather was warmer, I'd probably have rocks for the rest of my fire pit. All right, let's talk about some tinder, and then we'll get the fire started. Here's a little image of where I'm at. You can see this is a pretty swampy area, and I purposely came down this hill. I could probably just start the fire with the hemlock that I have, the tiny little branches, and I've got some other dry leaves around there. But I wanted to come down to the water to show you this, because oftentimes when you're near water, you're going to bump into things like Phragmites or cattail or this type of grass, and you have grasses that grow down just near swampy areas. Certainly it's going to be wet because you're in a swampy area, but right now there hasn't been a ton of rain recently, and this stuff, I just grabbed a hold of it. It's very dry, so I'm going to grab some of this, kind of crush it up to make it really fluffy, and then we'll bring it back and get the fire going. But this is always a good option to go down to an area that has some kind of marsh, because it's possible to find things like I said, Phragmites, cattail, other types of grasses that'll start up pretty quickly. So that's why I came down here. So I made all my preparations. The final thing I did is when I found this downed birch tree, I took some of the bark off the tree, put it on the ground just to get the fire a little bit up off the ground, so get some of the moisture away. This stuff is relatively dry. And you can use a green wood. You could actually put it on a nice flat rock if you can find one that is, again, not going to explode on you, but just want to get it a little bit off the ground. I've fluffed this up. I kind of crushed it up and fluffed it. I got all my wood around me ready to go. Let's get my fire starter out here, and we'll get a spark in that, and we'll show you how to get the fire going. Again, I'm putting the fire starter right in this guy to get it started. Almost. Okay. Here we go. I'm going to put our smallest layer of wood on there. Get that started up. Feed a little bit more on. You just give a little bit more oxygen Move that around. There we go. A little bit more wood. You can hear it's crackling. There's definitely a little bit of moisture going on here. And I actually have some birch. I'll show you that in a second, but let me get this guy going a little bit more. Just grab some smaller twigs. Just add a couple slightly larger ones. You're probably well aware of this, but the big thing when it comes to fire is oxygen flow. So if your fire starts to dampen out, you can get a stick and just kind of lift it up to get that oxygen flowing and moving around in there. So here's this. Obviously we got a pretty committed fire at this point, but you want to feed it until you're sure it's not going to go out on you. I can definitely hear some crackling and sizzling. So I'll put that up like that, and we'll get that moving a little bit. Get a little bit hotter, a little bit higher, a little more flame, and then we'll come back and show you what it looks like when we got it fully going. Here's our fire, burning pretty strong. At this point, I would say I'm confident that it's going to keep going. You can see I've got some larger pieces of wood laid on it. You can also see I've opened up kind of the containment area for my fire. Also want to show you this. That's all the wood I have left. Everything else has been used so far, and the fire's been going less than 10 minutes. So again, just a reminder, make sure you got lots of firewood piled up so that you are ready to feed this guy. It's not going to die out on you. I do want to show you one other thing that's pretty interesting. If I could pick up this piece of birch bark, let me find it. Yeah, here you go. If you can see here, it kind of bubbles up, and the reason is because there is, there are oils and other things in this. So it's not just a piece of wood burning; it's got oils that'll actually, spark quite quickly. When the fire was first going, it was actually putting out not just kind of white or clear, clear smoke, if you will, but some kind of blackish smoke, and that is from the oils and things that are in this birch bark. And this stuff went up quickly, so I had to actually work on containing the fire and shifting it a little bit so that it didn't get too out of control. So be very happy when you find birch, but also be careful with it, because it really does take off quickly. So there you have it, fire making 101 from the ground up. It's burning well, reflecting off the rock to give me some heat, and I'll hang out here for a while, then I'll put the fire out and adventure through the woods a little bit more.